Hello, brothers and sisters. A few verses from the Book of Common Prayer. Rend Joel 2:13. Rend your heart and not your garments. Turn unto the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and of great kindness, and repenteth him of the evil. As we proceed through our studies, let us not forget the doctrine of original sin as we do historical and theological history. We pick up with some comments by our introductory comments by Dr. Milton Anthony. D.R. MacCulloch notes in his chapter, well, that's interesting. Is he in this book? I believe he is, now that I think about it. Give me a second here. Dermot MacCulloch, he's the famous scholar on church, on Thomas Cranmer. Yes, the Church of England and International Protestantism, page 316, 1530 to 1570. That's going to be fascinating to read his comments. He is quite the historian of Tom Cranmer. MacCulloch notes in his chapter not only was the influence of Zurich decisive in the course of the English Reformation, and many of the Edwardian reforms make the Church of England look like a subset of magisterial Reformed Church. No wonder I've got this supermarked in my much read OHA1 that may be observed in other European Reformations. MacCulloch identifies several continental equivalents of Henry VIII's ambiguous Reformation, while the subsequent English shift away from Lutheranism is also observable in the territories of Archbishop von Wied of Cologne and Countess Anna of East Friesland. The sacramentalist Lutheranism in the litany and church order devised by the Archbishop of Uppsala, Laurentius Petrinarius, also reveals notable similarities with the English Preliminarily and Ordinal. As Hampton observes, episcopacy was evident not just in Lutheran churches, but also on the Reformed side in Poland, Lithuania, and Hungary, while the Geneva forms of ecclesiastical jurisdiction, independent of the civil magistrate, were opposed not simply in England, but also in Zurich and elsewhere. If Cranmer aspired towards a reformed Catholicity, this is precisely what all the continental reformers sought as well, and he references MacCulloch's book on Cranmer, page 617. It was not reflective of an instinctive and distinctive English anti-confessionalism to declare oneself a Christian Catholic rather than a Protestant, and to reflect that Calvin was the only man and that his words should not be taken as inherently truthful. These are also standard sentiments observable in hardline continental circles, footnote, Libertas de Principiis, and Sebrandus Libertas de Ecclesia, Franeker. MacCulloch also finds echoes of the views of Zurich's Heinrich Bullinger, even in the writings of the apparently quintessential Richard Hooker. These are all useful reminders that we do not need to invoke a unique English mentality, and I've got that circled, underlined, highlighted, when explaining different trends in the Church of England. It is arguably more helpful and accurate to see elements of the English religion within the diverse European spectrum rather than uniquely separated apart from it. It is also interesting to note the degree to which the supposedly most distinctive features of Anglicanism, such as anti-Calvinistic doctrines of grace and the belief in the iure divino, or divine right episcopacy, owe part of their development to the input of foreign divines. In the Elizabethan Church, it was the Flemish refugee Hadrian Savaria, later one of the translators for the King James Bible, who made some of the most decisive early developments to the English doctrine of iure divino episcopacy, seeing this continuous form of church government from the apostles' time as a sacred canon, and who linked his extreme clericalism to the interpretation of royal authority in a manner much anticipated by later Laudian developments. And he references Peter Lake, Anglicans and Puritans, Presbyterians and English conformist thought, from Whitgift to Hooker. That looks like an interesting book. And then anti-Calvinists, the rise of English Arminianism. That is a good read. Similarly, it was the Spaniard Antonio del Coro and the French Huguenot exile, Peter Barrow, who led the way in opposing Calvinist doctrines of grace in Elizabethan Oxford and Cambridge, respectively, where they ran into opposition from the majority of native English divines who upheld Calvinistic orthodoxy. In the Jacobean Church, it was expatriates such as the Frenchman Isaac Casaubon and the ex-Roman Catholic Archbishop of Spalato, Marco Antonio de Dominus, who first expressed the notion that the Church of England was uniquely faithful in its appeal to antiquity. We've seen that debunked a number of times. Church of England's curious constitution arguably enables certain forms of churchmanship to appear and develop with less impediment than on the continental churches. But the English were not necessarily the first to grasp the opportunities thereby offered. Arguably, what students of Anglicanism need is a more informed sense of the sheer variety of early modern Protestant European Protestantism. This should enable English Protestantism to take its place among the dizzying spectrum of ideas and forms of organization, rather than remaining as an outside observer of a continental religious order that is too often assumed to be monolithic. Great having historians around like this. There were significant disparities between the Reformed churches in Reformed church organization and government, church-state relations, liturgical practices, and in doctrine and piety. As Hampton and MacCulloch observe, it is only if the Church of England is relentlessly measured against the example of Geneva that it seems less reformed. Quoting P. Benedict Christ's Church is Purely Reformed, A Social History of Calvinism. We have noted how far some supposedly distinctive elements were actually shared by other Reformed churches, but the picture is still richer and more interesting than that. In fact, the Church of England was in some ways more Calvinistic than the continent. Isn't that something? Isn't that something? Where you ever going to hear that in an Episcopal church or in an Anglican context today about the Elizabethan and Jacobean church? Where, except here? Calvin's works were more popular in England in the later 16th century than in any other European country, including Calvin's native France. And it was the famous English divine William Perkins, whose writings provoked the most important work Opposing Calvinist predestination by the Dutch theologian Jacob Arminius. And there, W.B. Patterson, William Perkins in the Making of Protestant England. I would recommend for the scholar of this period to just simply buy everything in the bibliography. These are all Oxford and Cambridge press publications, largely Yale Press. Otherwise, you have to be captive to what others say about the period. I've read myself to the view that the Church of England was reformed in its first 80 to 100 years, and then I just kept seeing this, that, and the other, and it kept accumulating. And then I remember being at Salisbury with the dean of Westminster Abbey. He was traveling with us, and asking him, standing on the green there at Salisbury, was Cranmer reformed? I know I had come to that view, but I was kind of casting about for others who might support and advance that. And he said, oh, definitely. And my ears were kind of perked up. Did I hear you right? You said he was reformed. Oh, definitely. Then my wife and I walked up to St. Thomas of Becket Church up north of the cathedral there, about a mile. We had a wonderful chat. He's the dean at Westminster Abbey now, or canon, not dean, I'm sorry, canon. He was an assistant canon in earlier years, and then he went back to Clare College at Cambridge as the dean there. Chaplain. Then he's gone down to be the top canon at the Abbey. So that was kind of confirmatory and helpful to hear that. And then that same year, I went to a prayer book conference, and Dr. Paul Avis was there, and I asked the same question, and he goes, I don't think so. Well, what about Dr. Justification by faith? He kind of had this quizzical, far-off look and turned around and walked away. He was being polite. I was being, but it was a conversation that was ended and not desired. Very peculiar. As the events at the Calvinist Synod of Dort demonstrated, some European countries had more liberal religious traditions in some respects than those displayed by the English divines, and their representatives occasionally displayed a greater readiness than the English to accommodate their religious opponents. Citing Dr. Anthony Milton, the British delegation, and the Synod of Dort. We've got that around here, back over there. Needs to be reread. I remember discovering that years ago. Now, this was published by him in 2005. Yeah, it'd be 10, 15 years ago, and I read that thing, and I nearly fell out of my chair. First time I ever heard anywhere, and I went through Reformed Episcopal Seminary. They were all Dortrectian, the professors, but we never heard about Englishmen going to the Synod of Dort. And I dare say that's could largely be repeated widely through the Episcopal world. But fortunately, we got men like this, Dr. Anthony Milton. Another linked misconception is that the Church of England only differed from the continent in conservative forms of religious worship and government, which should therefore be deemed the sole criteria of Anglicanism as a uniquely orthodox feature of the English Church. It is certainly true that there was no shortage of foreign divines who were perplexed by some of these aspects of the Church of England. Not only, though, were defenses of bishops and conservative religion not yet unique to English divines, as we've seen, but there were some very distinctive elements of English Protestantism on the Puritan side. If we look at the well-informed European contemporaries and what they saw as distinctive of English religion, we will find that they were convinced that it was practical divinity. In the 1630s, the outside observers Samuel Hartlib, a Polish exile, and John Dury, a Scottish-born international Irenicist, were emphatic that this was the case and saw the active dissemination of this unique form of English religion as the key to international Protestant unity and reform. They racked their brains to find ways of creating foreign consumption of a complete body of practical theology combined with a comprehensive body of case divinity, and arranged for petitions to be sent from foreign divines to English clergy, pleading for such a work to be produced. Strict Sabbatarianism was another area where the English made a very distinctive contribution. The celebrated independent divine John Owen complained that hostile Dutch theologians referred to Sabbath doctrine as figmentum Anglicanum. But more sympathetic Dutch clergy consciously embraced English teaching on the issue. And the Dutch Second Reformation, Adire Reformatiae, with its strong emphasis on practical piety, was profoundly influenced by English Puritanism and by Sabbatarianism in particular. Congregationalism was another area of distinctly English religious development. In the 1640s, the leading Congregationalist independent divines observed that the foreigners granted, as Drury and Harleb did, that the power of godliness had been more advanced and held forth in England than on the continent. But they also laid claim to the light which conflicts of our own divines, the good old nonconformists. In other words, the conservative English religious settlement, in generating Puritanism, had also generated new and distinctive thinking on church government and revealed the truth of Congregationalism to the English before continental thinkers. Similarly, it has been suggested that English Presbyterianism thought in the 1640s created a unique reading of the church and church government, differing from all foreign Reformed Presbyterian writings. The reference here is to H. Powell, Crisis of British Protestantism, Church Power in the Puritan Revolution, published by Manchester. As we can see, then, to treat as truly Anglican only certain forms of ceremonialism and liberal theology is to look at only a few features of the distinctive religious developments that emerged from the incoherent English Reformation. It argues implicitly that the more evangelical modes of doctrine, government, and piety promoted by English Puritans were un-English and unthinkingly reflective of continental norms, which was manifestly not the case. As the chapters in this volume demonstrate, to seek to locate Anglicanism within the first 130 years following Henry VIII's break with Rome is a quixotic enterprise. The period was one of multiple reformations, multiple settlements, and multiple trajectories of religious change. And that's what seems to this reader an overstatement. Flying in the face of acts of conformity. Yes, there was dissent from that, but how much of the nation conformed? There was no Roman Catholic churches allowed. Baptist churches weren't allowed. Congregationalism was illegal. There was no such thing, really, just mere ideas and amongst a few. How extensive was this? But to characterize it with has all this going that there and that elsewhere, I don't know. This means that different stages of this process can be sieged upon to present very different readings of Anglican identity. We began this introduction with a view of three prominent approaches to the first century of the Church of England that have adopted starkly different readings of Anglicanism in its early history. One tendency with the evangelicals has been to stress the Reformed aspect of the Tudor Reformations as definitive, while another has been, with the Tractarians, who emphasize instead the 17th century as a time when Anglicanism truly discovered itself. That's to forget all that preceded it, too. A third approach with the pre-Tractarian High Churchman seizes upon elements of apparent principled moderation, reverence for the past, and the invoking of a middle way in both the 16th and 17th centuries in order to trace a tradition of via media Anglicanism. All three of these tendencies are ones into which modern historians of the Church of England sometimes unconsciously, and in many times only momentarily drift, even when we eschew the specific word Anglican. All three approaches have plentiful evidence to support their interpretations because of the essentially heterogeneous nature of the English Reformation. It sounds like Milton is going for the high church approach, yet none presents an adequate account of the Church of England's identity in the first century of her existence, because each seeks to locate a single orthodox identity based upon a selective reading of the evidence. Some Anglicans have sieged upon this very heterogeneity as evidence of the Anglican genius for comprehension and felicitous indecision. But this ignores the fact that the variety was generated by conflict and change, rather than emerging from any native taste for principled irresolution. Few contemporaries embraced incoherence, uncertainty, and ambiguity as not only good things, few embraced that, but as inherently Anglican things. This was a period when there was a struggle for the identity of Anglicanism in the sense of combat between many different groups to define what the contested definition of the Church of England truly was and where Protestant orthodoxy truly lay. The modern association of Anglicanism with specific ideas and emphases, conservative, ritualistic, non-confessional, moderate, reflects the triumph of those trends in the church. We should not, though, read that particular victory and set of associations back into the first century, when their triumph was far from assured and their preponderance far from self-evident. Well, we're done with chapter 1 at last. That was a long read. That was some, 30-ish pages of divagation here and there. The next chapter is the emergence of the Church of England, 1520 to 1533, by Ethan Shagan. And this won't be quite as long, about 14 pages. And let's see who Ethan Shagan is. Professor Shagan, professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. He's published The Rule of Moderation, Violence, Religion, and Politics of Restraint in Early Modern England. Also, that's Cambridge Press, Catholics in the Protestant Nation by Cambridge, 2009. And Religion in Tudor England, an anthology of primary sources. So that is what we will start with, I think, next time. We take the professor's point in the chapter about the contest, but I think it's a little overstated. Yes, there were recusants in England, Jesuits. We realize they went underground. They appeared in the gunpowder plot in 1604. Not every Catholic surrendered his arms, as it were, or his doctrine. Yes, there were competing thoughts within the church. Should we wear albs and do the dress-up stuff, the Edwardian? Yeah, the first Edwardian prayer book, they had that too. They were united on the Lord's Supper, which was a major piece, except for two of the bishops. All the others were Reformed. It was widely Calvinistic. Now, where's all this heterogeneity? So I'm not sure if Dr. Milton, he's presented this wide case for all this infighting. I'm not so sure that's an overstated thing. I just don't know, but it's something right there. I want to get a hold of Patrick Collinson and get his sense too, because he's on the same level. And I'm not even sure Patrick Collinson is in here. Is he still alive? I'll check that later. If he's alive, it makes no sense that he's not got a chapter here. I wonder what Dr. Gerald Bray thinks as he reads that. He'll understand it, but I wonder what weight he gives to that last paragraph in chapter 1. But with that, let us close. Lord, we read some sentences from the scripture about original sin and actual sin, and we don't know where that shows up in church history, but we have to sift and assess. It's your providence, O Lord, and we show respect for your providence by studying it, not taking it in a light and irreverent way. Viewing church history is under your government. Help us to those ends, we pray. Amen. Until next time, Godspeed.